If you automate a broken process, it just breaks down that much faster. So it's really understanding the relationships that you have from a supply chain, the business processes that you have in place, find the blind spots that you have so you know how to map out a technology and a digitization journey. Look at those relationships because the relationships are key.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Paul. Paul, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And Tom, thanks for having me. Again, my name is Paul Magel. I am with Computer Generated Solutions. We're a global software and technology solutions company. I am responsible for the global software business. We have a software platform. Our product is called Blue Cherry. We primarily focus vertically in the fashion business, apparel, footwear, and accessories. I always say we're the unfashionable side of fashion. We're focusing on the back office solutions. And again, to your podcast, really dealing with the supply chain issues that the industry is facing and focusing on today.
Okay, and what kind of problems are you solving for your clients, Paul?
Again, we really touch on everything from supply side, demand side, making sure efficiencies across the supply chain. A big piece now that we're starting to see is around the whole sustainability piece and how do you track where goods are coming from, how they're being made from a labor compliance standpoint, and how things are going forward. But it's all about efficiencies and distribution of goods to the customers in an efficient manner. So again, all of the back office functions all the way through distribution and then the finance and the accounting side.
Okay, and I saw on the website that you've been with the company since 97, I think it is.
Yeah,
So,
28 years in 2025. And, I used to say I was 10 years old when I started. Now that's even sounding old, bro. I was trying to say I was 5 when I started, but, a lot has gone on in those last 28 years.
okay, what has happened in the last 28 years that has surprised you most?
Well, that's a loaded question. It's gonna take me 28 years to answer the question, but, you know, obviously, we've gone through some, titanic shifts from a technology standpoint, right? The most recent one being artificial intelligence and AI. Probably prior to that was the internet and the whole connectivity of the world, and then prior to that, may wanna go from kind of the mainframe centralized solutions to much more what back then was client server to now we've got this whole cloud enabled world, and we're moving from totally cloud based to hybrid cloud based. But those are kind of those years, kind of the major iterations. And again, I think currently everybody's getting their arms around artificial intelligence and what that means to them and their business model.
Hmm, fair enough. And I mean, digital tools are reshaping supply chains. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for digital transformation to drive sustainability today?
Yeah, so tremendous amount of opportunities, right? And you asked specifically about sustainability, but you know, digitization of supply chain and the use of artificial intelligence really crosses everything, which again certainly brings sustainability in it as well. I tend to speak to my team and even my customers when we talk about AI around kind of three P's, and I try to make it as simple as possible for folks to understand. Is first P is productivity. So it's how do we look at the things that we're doing day in, day out to get our job done? And that can be along
Mm,
the supply chain and that can be in terms of sustainability. But with the new digital tools, with AI, how do we get more productive so we get more done than we've done in the past? Second P is process. Our interactions with our customers and how we work and the tools that we have across the supply chain, how do we improve that process? How do we really turbocharge those tools through artificial intelligence to make them more efficient, more intelligent, and more proactive? And then the third piece is product. And certainly as a software industry executive, what can we be infiltrating into our product set from an AI standpoint to add more value to our customers as we go forward? So again, from a sustainability standpoint, the only way you can track sustainability and find and respond to all the compliance and rules and regulations that are coming out now is to digitize that whole supply
mm.
chain from your vendor all the way through to the consumer. So that's kind of the first step, is to get everybody connected digitally. And I think AI will help to accelerate that as we go forward. And certainly new platforms. I mentioned cloud-based open APIs, and just some of the newer technologies that allow us to be much more interactive at how we communicate among systems will help drive that message and value proposition.
Okay. And what about something like transparency? It seems to be kind of the holy grail of modern supply chains. How far are we from achieving real time end to end visibility across supply chains?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting conversation, right? And when it comes to sustainability, I talk to a lot of people who are very, very passionate about sustainability. And
Yeah.
I always say, hey, as a technology guy, it's really not that complicated. To me, it's just another field in the database, right? So in order to be transparent, means you have to have the information, you have to track it. So from a technology platform standpoint, it's about having the right container to capture the data that you want to capture, where something was sourced, who touched it, the amount of labor was put into it, the raw materials that were used, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to track all of that. And then then we have to have kind of a reporting layer so we can report back
Mm,
to whether it's government agencies, the consumers, or to your stakeholders about those goods and where they came from and how they're being utilized. And then from a platform standpoint, we've got to have open APIs and things so we can connect from system to system so that data is going forward. So, you know, your question was how close are we or how far are we? From a technology standpoint, the capability is certainly there. You know how complex supply chains are. It's one getting
mm,
every link on that chain connected, which again, if you go back a few years ago, and I didn't bring it up in that first question about some of the major changes, which was blockchain, right? Blockchain was talked about tying this all together, building all this, but it was a very heavy lift in terms of technology, a very heavy lift. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So if you don't have the data in that chain, then you're not transparent or traceable as we go forward. So technologically wise, we're there. We can handle it. The challenge is getting that entire supply chain linked together. There's some old legacy systems that have to be updated. There's suppliers in parts of the world that don't have some of the infrastructure that's required to provide that going forward. And it's not also just about reporting on it. The other question is how do you validate that data,
right.
which is kind of the next piece of it. People can put things into the system as much as they want, but how validated is it? And that's where I think AI is going to help come and accelerate that. So she can start doing things like tapping into public satellite feeds and start looking at your suppliers and start rating your suppliers. And based on activity from those satellites, you can kind of see where people are living, how they're living, how much time they're spending in the factories, as one example of one way to use technology to kind of help with that certification of data and traceability, as you mentioned.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And what about costs? Because, sustainability often feels like it's a trade off with cost efficiency. How do businesses strike that balance effectively?
Yeah, I think that's something that people are struggling with here in 2025, right? There's certainly requirements coming in from the consumers. If you look at the data, they'd like to buy from a company who's more sustainable, who's not exploiting workers and those types of things. But it also costs more to do that. And I think the data also shows that there's a certain point where as much as people desire to purchase those types of goods with those types of attributes, there's only a certain amount of money they're willing to spend for
Mm,
those. So again, I think that's also where technology comes in again today. So we talked about kind of that first P about productivity and using AI to become more productive. So if I can do more with less and deploy technology to make us more efficient, we hopefully can drive the costs down so that when we bring in that traceability data and we start looking at some of the costs of doing business to allow it to make that more visible and accessible to the consumers, that it's done in a way that it's the right product at the right price at the right time. So the customers have what they need and they've got it at a price point they're willing to pay for. So again, I think it's a balance that everyone's kind of looking at into how do we give them what they need, give the government what they need, and still be able to provide a product that people are willing to pay for.
okay. And you mentioned AI. It's obviously transforming supply chain planning, but how can it handle the increasing unpredictability of global disruptions? I mean, they're popping up all the time now, it seems.
Yeah. So again, AI and just that whole digitization of the supply chain, right? At the end of the day, it's all about collecting as much data as you can to build not only predictive models, but to be much, much more agile as you go forward. So, one of the big benefits of AI is to take a tremendous amount of data and be able to make not just looking in the past and make predictions from the past, but also sensing demand that's current, sensing different things that are going on. I talked about satellite images and input. It could be weather related models and predictive models that can all be brought into how we can bring all of these pieces together to be much more efficient. So I think AI is going to help drive that efficiency going forward, allow us to build a much broader base of supplier relationships and much
Mm.
more. I speak to my clients a lot about, if we didn't learn the lesson during COVID about having a supplier relationship that's much more kind of a risk reward model where you're tied together. But by having the ability to sense demand, know where the consumers are going to want what they want, you can diversify your supplier base much, much more. And then based on where the demand is coming from, whether it's onshore, near shore, or you're doing things offshore, you can really have a much more of a balanced supply chain. And then just going back to your question is once I have a balanced supply chain and I know the attributes of that supply chain, if there is a disruption that comes and I'm digitized and I have real-time information, I can quickly reroute or remake or reorder or do whatever I need to do to be much more agile to navigate whatever disruptions may come in the future. So summarizing, just we've got to have a much more diversified supply base. You can't just look at one region, follow the cheapest needle, because if that gets tariffed or if that's a region that gets shut off because of geopolitical issues, you have no other place to go. But if you've built out a very wide breadth of supplier base because of the data that's now available through that digitization of the supply chain, it gives you many, many more options as you go forward. And based on what AI can bring to the table in terms of demand predictability, you can make the pieces in the right place or revert if there is a disruption in that supply chain.
Fair enough. And what about things like then circular economy? It's we're starting to see an uptick of interest in circular economy in the kind of manufacturing space, for example. But in the fashion industry, is that starting to take hold as well? Are companies taking steps to embed reuse and recycling into their supply chains?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of that going on, right? You're seeing rental companies coming up. You're seeing, a lot of different areas, certainly from a standpoint of raw material sourcing, where they're getting raw materials from. The goal is to really reduce the waste. This industry, produces a tremendous amount of waste. So one thing
Mm,
is being able to better forecast demand. And, AI in the supply chain, that's one of the first areas folks are looking at is demand forecasting and making sure we're, making to the demand and not overproducing, which will help from a sustainability standpoint and putting less into the landfills and those types of things. Certainly so that piece as well. And then again, as you look at folks who are looking at models now where things can be returned and repaired and sent back rather than being replaced, rental models, and again, using technology to trace garments. So even when you're renting them, you know where they came from initially. So I think it's a combination of looking at producing less, so there's less waste,
mm.
reusing what's already been produced in a way that's efficient, and you're seeing business models come up on that as well. And again, I think technology just drives the ability to do that going forward.
Okay. And what about the regulatory environment? How should businesses prepare for emerging environmental regulations while staying competitive? Because as we're seeing, there are far more regulations coming up in this space globally. It's not just here in the EU, but globally.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if you look back again in the past, like you had asked me, look in the beginning of the conversation, is you would say it was primarily an unregulated industry, and now it's much more moving to a regulated industry. And certainly, what's going on in Europe in terms of regulations around ESG and sustainability, environmental, and societal, and governmental type, is becoming much more relevant as part of a business model, right? Where I think initially a lot of this was looked at as a public relations brand identity standpoint, but now it's becoming table stakes and it's just part of doing business, like customs compliance is part of doing business. And again, the only way you're able to do it is through deployment of technology, because you have to be able to document and prove where your goods are coming from, the makeup of your goods for each order, down to a kind of a PO level, down to a sales level. And again, if you don't have technology to track that, you're not going to be able to meet those new government regulations, and the penalties will put you out of business. So
Mm.
that now those regulations are now part of your business model, part of your costing structure, and part of your go forward model. Again, back to how you present yourself as a brand. It's less about that being what's going to drive your business, but it's more going to be if I'm not doing this, you're not going to have a business.
All right. Okay. That's a fairly sobering way of looking at it, I guess. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, but I think you have to, right? I think you have to look at it that way because that's the way the government's driving it.
And rightly so. In terms of agility, you talked about that earlier. Is agility becoming more important than efficiency in today's supply chain?
Yeah, and I think, somewhat they're a little bit tied together, agility and efficiency, right? So, we talked about kind of broadening that supplier base. The more
Mhm.
efficient you become, by definition, we're allowed to be more cost effective, which allows you then to do some of the things we spoke about earlier, being more sustainable and take on some of the additional costs that are required to track all those different data points across the supply chain. So efficiency ties into the agility, and then the agility is allowing you to overcome some of those, disruptions that we talk about in the supply chain. And also just being able to, as you have more data coming in, allowing you to be more responsive to consumer demand. So the days of, ordering products 6 months prior and then hoping it comes in and hopefully that the weather's warm or the weather's cold, depending on what goods you may be selling, you can either be much more real-time manufacturing as we go forward. We look at what's coming around with robotics and those types of things, or
Mm.
also combination, as I mentioned, onshore and nearshore type manufacturing, so you can respond much more agile to oncoming demand. So again, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think efficiency is important and agility is important. I think they're kind of tied together. And again, that linchpin is always the technology platform that's open and connected to as many points in that supply chain as possible.
Okay. I remember back when I was with SAP, I was talking to one of our customers, a guy called Christian Beskoff in Continental. And, Continental are known as the rubber company, the tire manufacturers. But in fact, that's only 40% of their revenue. The other 60% comes from building a lot of the smarts that we have in our cars. So they supply all the car makers with a lot of the smarts that are literally under the hood. And they went on this journey, pardon the pun, to create this remote vehicle data platform where they were
Yeah.
taking in data from customers' vehicles into this platform. And the idea was that they would sell it to the likes of service centers or fleet managers so that it would be a predictive maintenance platform.
Yep.
And so they were collecting all this data from all these cars, and they were approached by a weather company. And the weather company said to them, "You've got all this data from cars. You've got GPS, time of day, you've got windscreen wiper status, fog light status, et cetera, et cetera." The weather company realized that all these vehicles were little moving real time weather stations.
Yep.
And so suddenly Continental, going on this predictive maintenance project, had this whole other alternative revenue stream approaching them saying, here's a left field use of your data. And so I'm just curious, that story always struck me as fascinating because when you go on these data collection projects, there's often left field uses for data that might not have occurred to you. So I'm just curious, had you ever come across anything similar to that where you were collecting data or your customers were collecting data and suddenly they saw a whole new avenue open up for them?
Yeah. Look, it's an interesting example and a very interesting question, right? And again, as we talk about artificial intelligence, right, the same way we used to talk about business intelligence in the past, at the end of the day, it's all about the data. And it's all about that data being contextualized that then can be utilized through these different models. So
Mm.
more important than ever today is a story like that where that data is so important because that's what they're using to train these large language models on to be able to provide that intelligence back to the users. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, data, and the commercialization of data.
Mm.
As we go forward. One example, we have a partnership with Juki, and again, I mentioned we're very vertically focused in that apparel, footwear, and accessories brand. And Juki
Mhm.
came out with a line of smart sewing machines. We connected those to our manufacturing products through kind of a IoT device. So now we're collecting every time that needle's going up and down, we're collecting data. So one, to your point, from a preventive maintenance standpoint, we know exactly how much that machine has been used when preventive maintenance has to get done. So rather than starting at the beginning of the line and ending at the end of the line, we know exactly where to go. So you can be much more efficient from that. We
Uh-huh.
could also measure the efficiency of the operator and the operation. quality from a standpoint, and then also real-time visibility into goods on the manufacturing floor. So going back to that agility. And again, that's all data then that we're able to pull back into kind of our ERP solutions. And again, start to seed large language models and AI capabilities so that then the supply chain predictions and what's going on will be very, very important going forward to make a much more efficient supply chain interaction. So yes, data is key to all of this, and it's clean data. I think a lot of people are learning as they start deploying AI. First step is going to be get your arms around your data and
Hmm.
make sure
Yeah.
that you're not training models on data that can't be interpreted appropriately. Because again, as you know, there's a term called hallucinations, and
Yeah.
AI will put out information that's incorrect. So, as a software provider, you have to be very careful before you commercialize anything and before you start taking actions on data coming out of these models, that it's got to always be correct. Otherwise, you're going to produce goods that no one wants, or you're going to produce more goods than people want because you're relying on that data to make forecasting recommendations and those types of things. So data is the fundamental key to all of this, and that's why that's a relevant story, because it's becoming
Mm.
more important than ever in today's day and age.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. A left field question for you, Paul.
Okay.
If if you could bring in any historical figure or fictional character to
Yeah.
consult on building a resilient and sustainable supply chain, who would it be and why?
That's an interesting question, and you didn't give me any prep for that. So now you're gonna put me on the spot. Again, I'll say Winston Churchill just for
Ah,
that,
okay.
because I think people from a supply chain standpoint will tell you they've been going to war in terms of having to really strategize and plot, and the logistics that have to be put in place, and the strategy that has to be built. Again, back to your question about navigating disruptions. There's nothing more, I think, appropriate than disruptions that happen during a war, where routes are shut off, or troops are not where they're supposed to be. It can be likened to a supply chain, and I think just understanding some of the logistical, strategic thinking, someone like a Winston Churchill might be a very interesting conversation to have in regard to today's supply chain challenges that are there.
Nice. I like it. Very good. Very good. For supply chain leaders who are just starting their digital transformation journey, where should they focus first, do you think, to make the most impact?
Look, at the end of the day, I would say if you automate a broken process, it just breaks down that much faster. So it's really understanding the relationships that you have from a supply chain, the business processes that you have in place, find the blind spots that you have so you know how to map out a technology and a digitization journey. Look at those relationships, because the relationships are key. And again, I think they've got to be much more risk reward, shared reward, shared risk models as we go forward. So when things happen, you're able to react much quicker, and you've got a partner on the other end, not somebody who you're fighting with over, or do you need the goods anymore? You don't need the goods anymore, but you've got a relationship that are working together. And it's also going to be key because the data that we talk about that has to be shared. If you don't
Mm,
have a mutual beneficial relationship to get that data, that also becomes another contention point that you need to flatten. So everybody within that supply chain has to be more than willing to provide the data that you need. And sometimes that data will get you into their pockets a little bit. And people are very hesitant to show as much data as you need to show, where they're getting their goods from, who's working on those goods, how they're treating their workers. That's all important stuff. So I think, those are the areas really to focus on.
okay. What's one often overlooked step companies could take to make their supply chains more sustainable without breaking the bank, let's say?
Again, it's just information, right? And it's being able to report. So as I said, from a technology platform standpoint, it's not a heavy lift. So it's,
Mm,
again, going back to that business process, making sure you know who your partners are on the other side, and making sure you've got an agreement to get the data that you need to be able to report on in an efficient manner. But if you do that, of course, they're not going to go wildly out of whack. And if you're working with reputable suppliers, you're not going to find a blind spot that someone comes around, because at the end of the day, you're going to be the one that's responsible in terms of how you source. So it's going to be, without heavy lift, it's doing your homework, partnering with the right organizations, and then having an agreement on the data that you're going to collect, and make sure that you've got some way to validate that going forward.
okay, fair enough. Um, If you had to make one bold prediction about the supply chain of 2030, what would it be?
Supply chain of 2030. Let's hope that all the work that we're putting in now, it's going to be much more efficient than it's ever been. People have much more information about their supply chain, so they can make much better decisions. I hope that it's much more diversified from a standpoint where people have many more kind of chains in that link that gives them a lot more agility to move and produce and collect and source from many different areas around the globe so that they're never kind of hamstrung or stuck if something breaks out or a tariff comes out or a disruption happens in shipping or logistics or whatever it may be. So I'm hopeful that they will be more complex in nature but more simpler to understand and manage because of technology deployment going forward in terms of what's happening with platforms like the Blue Cherry platform, what's happening with AI and artificial intelligence, and again, also what's happening because of government focus and regulations, which is forcing people to be much more astute in their supply chain.
Okay, great. What metrics or KPIs do you think companies should focus on to measure the success of their sustainability initiatives and ensure continuous improvement?
Look, you can be very simply from a KPI standpoint is don't get fined and don't get called out in the press. But I think that's every company, as I said earlier on, right? It's some of the first steps is really to understand your business process, understand your blind spots, understand the white space, and then those KPIs will come out of that in terms of as you start to build out your roadmap, you're going to want to have measurements along the way and measure certain things. One is how you're progressing along that
Mhm.
and then the other KPIs will be specific to, the requirements of your business, both from the government side, but also from your consumer standpoint to make sure you're measuring yourself in a way that's going to continue to allow you to build your brand and continue to build your business.
Okay. Are there any books, movies, documentaries that you found particularly inspiring when thinking about sustainability or leadership?
Yeah, from a leadership standpoint, I'm actually in the middle of, I don't want to call it a book because I do it in my long commute back and forth here in New York, but it's Rockefeller's 38 letters to his son and it's very interesting. But one of some of the interesting things. There's a lot of leadership stories in there, everything from competition to pricing to ethics in business. And what I find interesting is that these letters are being written from late 1800s, early 1900s, and the lessons being taught to J.D. Rockefeller's son back then are the same lessons that I'd like to be, teach to my kids today and my subordinates today because it really crosses the boundaries of time. So that's one that's relevant because I'm actually listening to it on my commute in now, but it's a great leadership lessons in there. A lot of basic blocking and tackling, but it's very good to kind of continue to reinforce some of those things and get the perspective of somebody who had the success that he had.
Fascinating. Great. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Paul. Is there any question that I didn't ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
I think, one is I want to just make sure if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. Our website is www.bluecherry.com or cjsinc.com. You can find out more about our platform there as well in terms of the work we're doing. Again, we've got customers across the globe working on supply chain issues every day. As I say, we kind of eat, sleep, and live these things. We've got over 500 customers that we work on a best practices basis with. So, I know what your audience is interested in, and more than happy to have further and follow-on discussions with anybody who wants to discuss anything further. I said LinkedIn, or just reach out to me any way you can.
Okay, fantastic. I'll put those links in the show notes, Paul, so everyone has access to them. Great. Paul,
Perfect.
that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Tom, been my pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation.